Hi, I'm Ron Cole, and this is part 2 of my tutorial on how to make plaster molds for casting rubber parts. And before I begin mixing any plaster, I want to show you all of the things that you're going to need ahead of time to get started. The first thing that you're going to need is a material for embedding into the plaster, just to strengthen it up a little bit more to prevent cracks from turning into a disaster should they ever happen. My favorite material to use for that is burlap. Burlap is very absorbent and very flexible when you have it mixed into the plaster, and you can take little swatches of it and put it all over the sculpture. And I cut all my burlap up ahead of time. I cut it up into many little swatches, more than I know I'll need because I don't want to run out while making the mold. And that, little swatches like this will bend around shapes without buckling, and you can jigsaw puzzle them together. And the next thing you're going to need is a collection of mixing buckets. And again, just like the burlap, you want more of these than you think you're going to need ahead of time. And then after that, you're going to need a collection of a variety of sizes of brushes. Not good artist brushes. Plaster will definitely mess them up. And one thing I want to point out to you about these brushes is the texture. I like to use brushes that are not too firm and not too soft. The reason why is because you want to be able to scoop up plaster and stick it into the little nooks and crannies where you need it to be without your bristles wilting. And you don't want it too firm either, because you're working on clay and you don't want to be stabbing marks into it with a throwaway brush that have stiff bristles. Now, of course, you can't make a plaster mold at all without this. A big old bag of plaster. This is UltraCal 30 plaster. Best darn plaster for making a mold there is. You can make plaster molds with other types of plasters. You can use Hydrocal, you can use casting plasters, you can even use plaster of Paris. But this stuff's the best for a couple of reasons. One, incredibly strong. It's pretty much stone when it's finished, and that means you're going to be able to get a number of good castings out of your mold when it's done before you ever start to lose any surface from it. And the other reason why it's a great mold making plaster is because of the setup time. UltraCal has a good long working times, anywhere between a half an hour to an hour before it starts to become too thick for you to be using. And that is ideal because that gives you all the time that you will need to get the plaster everywhere you need to get it, do all your burlap dipping and get it where you want it without having to rush or in a panic. And the last thing that I'm going to recommend you have on hand is a big old bucket of water. And the reason why you need the bucket of water is not for mixing your plaster. It's actually for cleaning your brushes and your mixing bowls while you're working. And I'll explain by the end of this tutorial how to get rid of your excess used dirty plaster water, but I'll just tell you right now, the one thing you don't want to do is pour it down your sink. You don't want to clean your brushes in the sink. You don't want to go down the drain. You'll have a plumbing problem that you won't want to deal with, but there is a good way of getting rid of it. And I promise before the end of this video, I'll show you what that is. And so having said all that, we're just about ready to start mixing up some plaster. And I've already measured out the amount of water that I want for my first batch. It's going to be a relatively small batch. The first coat of plaster, and maybe even the second coat, it all depends upon how much coverage I get from the first batch. The first batch is, in a sense, the most important batch, because that's the batch that will reproduce all of your surface details, and you need to be very careful in how you apply it, because you want to avoid missing spots that will end up just being gaps in your mold. And we'll get to that right after I mix up some plaster, which I'm ready to start doing right now. When you begin adding your plaster to your water, it's important to sprinkle it in gradually until you've built up a mountain rising up out of the top of the water, and then you just let it sit and completely absorb the water until you can see that the plaster is fully saturated. After that, then just stirring it briefly with like a paint stirrer will get it completely blended. When you start adding the plaster, your first layer to your sculpture, you brush into any deep details and along straight lines, in between, wrinkles in your character or whatever, all the deepest spots, but you go into them with a very thin layer to be sure that you're not trapping pockets of air. At that point, your plaster should start to thicken up, and you can move to a bigger brush, adding on thicker layers. You'll probably do this in a couple of batches of plaster, and as one thing you'll notice is that when you start adding newer batches of plaster to older batches, the newer ones will set up more quickly. And you can start adding your burlap. I usually just dip it in and scrape the excess off, and like bandages, just lay them over the surface until you've got a whole patchwork over the entire surface. You'll notice that as you dip the patches of burlap in, a lot of the material falls off into the plaster, but that becomes useful. You pull out the loose strands later to stuff into places that are hard to get into, like armpits and between the legs and corners of the mold. Okay, and now I'm starting to finalize the mold, thickening up any areas that appear too thin, filling in any gaps that I find, and in general just smoothing out the entire surface of the mold and making it a bit more easy to handle and attractive and evenly thick. At that point, all there is left to do is just continue to add batches of plaster until you've reached half an inch to an inch in thickness over the entire surface of the mold. And all of my layers, I only added 2 more layers after the burlap layer, and I'm up to my favorite part, because after all the brushing is done, with my hands a little bit wet, you get to polish the surface out to a nice shine, smooth out all your edges, and that will just about do it for this half of the mold. And in the next segment, I'll show you how to break him out of his clay barrier on the back and get to work on doing the other half.